Thanks for tuning in to the 168 Podcast, a podcast from Mitchell Knight and Jordan Bird of the Clarence Church of Christ, aimed at helping you connect Sunday worship with everyday life.
Welcome to another edition of the 168 Podcast. My name is Jordan, and as you can see, I am by myself this time. If you're watching, I guess you can see that. If you're listening, you just know it's me talking so far. But anyway, it is me by myself this week on the podcast, and part of that's because Mitch is at Mountain Dew Week at Mountain View Christian Camp this week, and I am back home, and I'm also preaching this coming Sunday. I mean, none of this will matter for most of you once you finally see this episode or listen to this episode, but it gives you some context as to why we are not together for this episode and why I am presenting it to you today and bringing you this episode. And today, what I wanted to focus on was actually looking or reflecting on or reviewing, if you will, a podcast, which ironically, this is a podcast, but a podcast that I listened to this past week. And it was particularly interesting to me because I thought the person who was interviewed offered a lot of helpful, like very just practical, helpful things to those of us who are trying to think through how do we evangelize in the world in which we live in? Like, how do we help people who don't know Jesus to know Jesus? How do we help those who are disconnected from the church to make their way toward being part of the church? We all know the struggles that churches are going through right now, whether that's stuff with COVID, but even if it wasn't COVID, I think the trend that COVID has caused, it was accelerated because of COVID. Like, churches have definitely shrunk in size, if you will. Participation is definitely down. Like, I see that. I know a lot of you do too. That stuff, I think, and a lot of other people have said, would probably have happened just in a lot longer time frame, but it was already heading that way. And so it's not really like a surprise. It's sad for us who find hope and connection in the church and being a part of Christ, but it wasn't something that was totally unexpected by a lot of people, but it's still sad. But nonetheless, that's the world we live in. So we're left with the situation of how do we help re-engage people or engage people for a new time in who Christ is or being a part of his body, that is the church. And this episode that I listened to of this podcast, I thought had a lot of helpful things to talk about that, particularly because the person that was interviewed, which is Dr. Let me say it right here, Dr. Andy Bannister, and this was on the Thinking Out Loud podcast. And I'll try to link to this stuff in the notes for the show. And one thing that Dr. Andy Bannister mentioned, he's with a group, first off, he's with a group called the Solas organization, which is like an apologetics group. They focus on that, and they're based in the UK. But one thing that he mentioned in this episode that was striking to me, like a lot of Americans thinking through the cultural shifts that we're encountering right now, we think a lot of in terms of, we're moving toward a more post-Christian culture. And we've already done some episodes just recently on this on the 168 podcast. And Andy Bannister mentions that in Europe, or where he is in the UK, it's almost to a point now where it's in a post-Christian context. And what he means by that is it's past this point where culture was Christianized or built upon some sort of understanding of Christian principles or values, to where Christianity in the culture in which he finds himself in, or in Europe as a whole, in a lot of different places, it's almost now like almost an unknown thing. Like, for a lot of people, like so much time has passed where like their parents maybe disengaged from the church, or their grandparents, and then their parents weren't engaged in the church, and now they are the next generation, and they've been totally disconnected from the church, that they have almost no awareness of it. Like, it's just not part of their thinking of the fabric of society. And so he was saying for a lot of people in that situation, they would almost view someone who goes to like a church building or a worship gathering on a Sunday as like, oh, that's like an interesting hobby that you have. Like, it's different than the hobbies I have. But his wording like that alone says what it is. Like, it's a hobby. It's not even like a religious thing or a spiritual thing. It's just like a thing you do, and it's different than the things I do. And so he was saying like that reality is painting the picture of where he is, and we're probably lagging behind that in terms of where we are here in the United States. And we always can look toward Canada to see what's kind of coming down the road for us, or even more locally in the United States, we can look usually at either coast to kind of see what culturally is coming more the way of the center of the country. But I thought that was interesting where he was talking about it being a post-Christian society. And basically, it's almost like a new mission field if you look at it that way, because you have almost a whole country or a whole culture that doesn't know who Christ is. And they're not even connected to the church. So it's almost like going to... for those of you who are aware of like missions terminology, like going to the, I don't know if it's still called this, but like the 1040 window, which is that window of the world where it's like the hardest to reach out to people. It's a lot of them are Muslim countries. It's just a hard place for Christianity to take root in that area. And so in a lot of ways you have Europe becoming more like that, if you will. And we're not maybe quite there, maybe in the United States, but it one day could be the same. And maybe what's more interesting about this is it's probably more pockets of people. It's not that there aren't Christians in Europe, and it's not that there isn't the church there, or that there's some awareness of it there, but it's so much on the fringe of society, especially especially where people identify more as like a nuanced group. Like their group maybe just has no connection or no awareness to the church or to Christ, so they're unaware. So anyway, he painted that picture, which I just thought was interesting in and of itself. But a lot of this podcast episode, Andy Bannister and the hosts that are talking with him from the Thinking Out Loud podcast, they go through a series of like discussions, if you will, about, so what do we do like practically when engaging with people who don't know Jesus, aren't aware of Christ, or aren't connected to him, or aren't part of the church. And Andy Bannister made the point, and I think this is a helpful visual. He said, first, build a bridge, which isn't probably new to most of us. Like, yes, if you want to reach somebody, like you got to kind of reach out to where they are. But he mentioned, like, start the bridge where the people are, because otherwise you're going to build a bridge in the wrong place. And I think this is worth those of us in the body of Christ to think about, and how we interact with people on a daily basis. Like, yes, we may have a desire to have them come to know Jesus, and we're called to do that as followers of Jesus. But if you're starting at let me give you like a sermon or like a Bible lesson, and they have no idea what those things even are, you're building the bridge already in the wrong place. And so he's saying, like, build a bridge where people are. Make it to where they can understand what it is you're trying to talk about, and you understand where they're coming from. Like, do you even understand the needs of their heart at the moment, like what they're thinking about, what they're processing, those kinds of things. And I thought that was a very helpful thing to just kind of think about practically, because often we can think like, well, no, they need to know this. And it's like, well, yeah, they need to know that. But we need to think of less in terms of like here, make the decision. Like, we need to make decisions, or have people make decisions, or decide to follow Christ. Like, yes, they need to do that, but we need to think of it more in terms of probably like a journey. And we're starting the journey with this person here, and we're hoping that they eventually reach to here, where eventually maybe they do finally dip their toe into being united to Christ, whether that's in baptism, or eventually becoming a participating person within the body of Christ, which is the more fuller version of that journey. And so I thought that was a helpful thing, like build a bridge where people are. And I don't think that's necessarily new for a lot of people, but I think it is helpful to think about like, well, if I like building a bridge is important, but if you do it in the wrong place, that's definitely going to mess up how we approach not only our approach to people, but how they receive what it is that we have to share with them about Christ. Beyond that, the thing that Andy Bannister mentioned, and just some very practical things about what we can do to engage people who aren't connected to Christ. And I know a lot of the angst, I think, for a lot of people is like, well, I don't know what to say. And I'll be honest, like, I feel that way too. Like, as much as I can think through this process and like know like what I should do, like even listening to this podcast episode where I heard this guy talk, I'm like, internally nodding my head in agreement, like, yeah, like that's good, that's awesome, like that's what we should do. I'm even like thinking in my own mind, like, yeah, I could do that. But then I get to a moment where it's like, but in real life, like I struggle to sometimes know like what it is I should do. Like, how is it that I should talk to my neighbor who's not a follower of Jesus? Or how do I talk? Like, I know how to do like the easy daily things of just like, oh, how was your day? That kind of stuff. But like having an actual meaningful conversation, literally about things that are more meaningful than just like the shallow things of life. And it's not that the shallow things are unimportant, but like those aren't the things that are going to get us as connected to needing Jesus, probably in a more eternal and life holistic life sense, if you will. And so anyway, Andy Bannister mentioned that he tries to go through 4 questions when he encounters people, and I think these could be tweaked depending on the person, obviously. And he also referenced a book by Randy Newman, and it's called Questioning Evangelism, as a very practical book. From what I could tell, it's written in like 2004, but it looks like a pretty accessible book. And so I encourage you to look at that as just another avenue to kind of help you think of questions to ask people. And a lot of this has to do with like, I've mentioned this before in my preaching or teaching, and it was something that was very helpful for me when I was in Bible college early on. I had to take one counseling class, and I think almost the heart of this whole class was to help people understand like what counseling is and what it isn't. And at the beginning of the class, a lot of us had a hard time wrapping our heads around the fact that a lot of counseling is just actively listening to people. And a lot of the students, including me, like got hung up on like, well, when do you give the advice? Like, when do you give the advice? When does the advice come? And it's like we were missing the fact like we wanted to jump to advice before ever knowing what advice we even needed to give. So like if we didn't actively listen to the person who was there with us, we weren't going to know what advice to even point them toward. And so the whole point is like you have to start with listening, and then the answers or the advice can come. And it parallels well with a verse in First Peter where First Peter talks about always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have. And I think often we can focus on that verse. We can easily focus on oh yeah, I need to have an answer. But we miss the fact that an answer requires a question. And so are we in a posture with people where we can even hear the questions that they're asking? And a lot of that involves us asking questions or listening to them on the front end so that we can know where we can share what it is that the hope that we have, the hope that we have in Christ. And so just listening in general or asking questions is something that can be a very helpful thing in knowing what to talk to people about. Like, so think of it this way, instead of knowing like having this like prepared thing you need to be able to tell people about why they need Jesus, who Jesus is, that whole thing, like back up, start at like just asking questions about their life to see where they are. What is it that they're hanging their life on? Like, what are the things, the longings of their life? Like those things will start to give you platforms, if you will, to where you can kind of jump on and know where you can share your journey of how Christ has fulfilled that longing in your life. And so the 4 questions that Andy Bannister mentions are these. First, he asks people, do you believe in God or some spiritual reality or something like that? And what is that like? And so his whole point is like just kind of point blank asking. And this is where maybe this could be a little bit different in our culture than in his culture in Europe. Because if people are so post-Christian in a European context to where they're just naive, they're more just atheistic or secular, where like God or like a spiritual reality isn't even part of their thinking, it probably won't be as abrasive for them to even like answer that question, because for them it's like, well, I don't have one, and like it's not a like. Whereas I think in our culture, like it's so antagonistic right now, where like it's abrasive to almost ask that question a little bit. But I do know a lot of surveys point to how even if people don't talk about being religious or focus on God specifically, a lot of people usually will say like, well, I'm spiritual though, or will articulate some form of something that's like spirituality or something that's at least beyond the physical, whether that's like, the stars or something like that, I mean, yeah, that's still physical, but it's kind of like outside of Earth, outside of our control, that kind of thing. There's something that's transcendent, something beyond the human experience alone that seems to have something to do with something. And so a lot of people, even if they don't have like a very religious or God-focused experience, they may at least be willing to share about their spiritual reality or spiritual thoughts or feelings or things like that. And so just asking them, like, do you even believe in God? Or, do you have a spirituality? And, like, what is it? Can you just share with me what that is? Like, just be in a learning posture. Like, you don't even necessarily have to do anything with it yet. You're just trying to inquire about, like, what's something that's valuable to you. I mean, people like to share what's valuable about them. Like, if you have something that's valuable to you and you're excited about it, you tend to tell people about it, and other people would probably like to do that too. We may think that that thing may be misguided from a Christian perspective, but it doesn't mean that they still wouldn't share with you what it is that they find valuable. So that's the first question. Do you believe in God or some spiritual reality, and what is it, and what is it like? The second question is, what do you think a human being is? Or, like, what do you think it means to be human? Like, I mean, if someone is coming from a very just atheistic or secular standpoint of, like, well, we're just a bunch of atoms, they may land and they may tell you that, or they may say, they might, like, give that kind of up front, but then if you kind of press a little bit more about things, like, they may give you something more like, well, humans are all about caring for each other or living the fullest human life existence or getting the most out of life. Or, those could be some answers to that question. But again, it's something we all value. Like, we value humanity for the most part. We value our life usually specifically. And so it's just asking, like, what do you think a human being is? I mean, in our day and age right now, like, that's kind of a big thing. Like, what makes us different from animals? What makes all of us different or unique, if you will? And it's just asking about getting someone's read on, like, what do you think a human being is? Because on one hand, this will help paint the picture of their worldview. It will show you where humanity is, where humanity rests in relation to the rest of the things in creation or in relation to God. And so again, it gives you another platform to know, like, where they are and how you can relate to them. So, I mean, you may be building the bridge with them at this level and maybe not at the do you believe in God level. And so, again, it's the second question that he suggests. And I think, again, it's a helpful one because most people will have a take on, like, what it is to be human. A third question that he suggests is, what do you think has gone wrong with the world? Because his point is, like, nobody seems to ever think that nothing is wrong. Like, everybody always has an opinion about what is wrong with the world. So, again, this gives us an opportunity to get insight into people's lives of, like, where they think things have gone wrong. And if you take a moment and kind of think about this question, it's ultimately asking a question of where has humanity broken off from God, or where does sin exist in our world? You're not using that terminology in that question, but it is asking essentially the same thing, like, what's wrong with the world? From a Christian perspective, we would say that the world has separated from God, and that sin is something that separates us. Like, we would use that terminology. But this question is asking that in a way that's not necessarily directly inserting those things right away. Again, you're building the bridge here to eventually be able to maybe talk about those things in more specific or nuanced categories later, but it's not talking about something totally irrelevant from that. But again, most people will have a take on that. But again, that'll give you an understanding probably of where they're coming from, and it often, whatever is wrong with the world is where people are going to probably invest themselves in how they're trying to answer that. So they may not be doing that with God, but maybe they're doing that with, if they think, love is an issue, then they're going to be all about love, but it might be love in a way that we, how we see it differently as Christians, and maybe misguided from our standpoint. But at least, again, it gives you an understanding of where they're coming from and where you can begin to talk with them about things. And at some point, you can share more about where you come from on things. And one way that Andy Bannister mentioned in this episode is, first listen to what answers people give, but then you can always respond with, and this is where it takes humility on our end, because a lot of us want to be like, well, no, my opinion's right, and, like, you need to hear it out, and if you don't agree with me, like, I guess we're done. Like, and that just ends the whole, like, discussion thing altogether. We need to have the humility of probably being aware that we're already not going to probably agree with the person right away. Like, that should be just upfront understood. Like, they're not coming from where we're coming from. They're not believing in God. They're not in Christ. Like, they're obviously coming from a different place. We already need to know going in, they're not going to agree with us. But there are probably things, as we actively listen to them and their answers, there probably are things that we do resonate with. So I mean, our response to any of the answers that people give to those 4 questions could be like, well, some of what you say I resonate with. Like if someone talks about like, well, I think love is important in the world, like I don't know any of us that are like, oh, I'm anti-love. Like, no, like we want love in the world as well. Like we want care and compassion and all these things that people may articulate. Like we can say like I resonate with some things you're talking about, but you could also say like some of the things I think differently on. And this is where you have the opportunity to now insert like I think differently about these things because I follow Jesus and he gives a different viewpoint on that and a different perspective of it. And I see things a little bit differently and I see all these things interacting differently because of Jesus. And so his whole point in this episode of this podcast is saying like if we truly believe Jesus is compelling, I mean almost all surveys talk about like most people don't have an issue with Jesus. They usually have an issue with Christians, and usually that has to do with Christians either not living out what they say they believe or something along those lines. But usually Jesus is viewed favorably. But really at the heart of the gospel, Jesus is the thing that's compelling. And if we truly believe that Jesus is compelling, we won't have to sledgehammer our beliefs into the conversation. Like we can assert them and mention them like I just mentioned. Like, I resonate with some things you're saying, but I don't in this way, and this is why. Like those are valid things to share, but you don't have to do it in a like, well, you're just wrong. Like that mentality is probably just going to shut the conversation or any hope of a future conversation down. But sort of meeting them part way, like say like, like I get where you're coming from on this, like I resonate with that too, but I approach it kind of from this end. Like that then gives that it's at least in a posture where another person can be like, oh, I never thought of it that way before. I think we do the same thing in other ways, just maybe not in the context of like evangelism, if you think about it that way. But ultimately, Andy Bannister talks about how this whole process is essentially us actively looking or listening for the longings that people have in their heart. Like, what is it that that person's longing for? Like, is it like belonging? And so like they try to find belonging in whatever it is they mention. It could be this particular subgroup or this particular identity or pursuing this goal, whatever it may be. Like, what is the longing that that person has? And then how can we help steer the conversation to help them see that we see those desires fulfilled in Christ in a more fulfilling way? Like if someone says like, I long for a fulfilling life, but they're trying to fulfill that by acquiring X amount of wealth or a position of prestige or notoriety in some certain way, like that's how they're trying to seek that. But that's a very tangled way in a way that's separated from how Christ has designed us to live. Like we're not meant to like find life in that way. Like it's always going to fall short. But we can resonate with like, yeah, like I can see why you'd want to have like a place to belong or a place where you're valued. Like who of us doesn't want that? But like this is where we have the chance to say like, but I find that because in Christ, like I find it in the fact that Jesus values me. He values me just like he values any other person. Like I have a place to belong in his family, in his body. Like we have a place to insert those things there, but we don't have to just kind of tear down like where they're coming from to start with. Like we're trying to help guide them to see like there's a different way in which you can seek the longings you have. Like the longing isn't bad. You're just trying to fulfill it in a way that's ultimately not going to fulfill what you're hoping it will do. So I thought that was very helpful. I mean, it's a more nuanced way of doing it, but I think it's a way in which we can actively do with conversations with people. And it's really just thinking about, or I mean, you could use any variety of those questions. Those are just the ones he suggests, but it's just trying to draw out of people like where the thing behind the thing of life, if you will, like not just like, oh, I have a job, but like, why do you work the job you have? Like, it's probably helping you fulfill something of meaning in your life. And so, just going down that path, but it ultimately sets up a place where we then can share like what's meaningful to us, but it's allowing them to do that first and then us doing it in response to the conversation that we have with them. Another thing that was talked about in this podcast that I thought was interesting is they talk about in the podcast about how the public square is sort of this odd thing, especially in the United States right now, in terms of like the good news of Jesus being able to be shared there. And like if you look in the New Testament, you see a lot of different examples of like Paul sharing Mars Hill about Jesus, and like there's this opportunity in the public square for him to share. There were spaces, at least at that time, in more Jewish culture, like the synagogue, where Paul would go and like talk to people. It was a public venue where these things could be discussed, and they were talking about in the episode about like where does that exist now? And it seems like it's the more secular, especially American culture, has become. The only thing that sort of ties us together in like a public sense is the political. As weird as that sounds, like the only thing we all sort of collectively do or share, like we don't share these like common values anymore of like whether it be the Judeo-Christian values or even some of the more historic, just American things that we typically would say, like, well, we all share that. And we all know, like, our world right now in the United States is a lot more fractured and sort of pitted against each other. But yet, oddly, like the political system is where we still are united. It's like where we still go to try to battle these things out. It's where we all try to go to the polls to get a person in there to advocate for our side or whatever it may be. And it's just odd in one sense that like the thing that we all like almost don't like is still the thing that like we're dependent on to sort of bind us together. And Andy Bannister talked about how like we get caught up in thinking like, well, that's the sphere in which I have to interject Christianity. That's where I have to interject Christ. Like if we don't have it there, it's never going to happen anywhere else. And his whole point was like, there are a lot more other public squares in which we can engage that we just often don't think about. Like we think that's the only public square, whereas can you engage your neighborhood, your neighbors? I mean, it's still sort of political, but like your school board or just like more local community organizations, if you will, things that don't require you to have to jump so many levels to be in or to get someone into, but you have a place to engage in this more local level. And you do have opportunity in the public square to talk about your faith in relation to the process we already talked about of asking questions and seeing where people are coming from. And so I thought that was helpful because I think often we think like, well, we have to be in this like position or this platform to be able to do this. And it's like, no, like you are in the public square already in a lot of ways. Like your job is in the public square, your kids' activities are often in the public square, like your recreational activities are in the public square. There's a lot of things we do in the public square all the time that don't involve us having to be in a political position to interject our faith in Jesus, again, like in the process in which we just talked about. So I thought that was helpful as well, just to sort of like, okay, take a deep breath. Like you don't have to be at this level. Like you can do it down here. So I think that's helpful to think about. Lastly, one thing that Andy Bannister mentioned in this episode was just the normal way in which followers of Jesus are able to make their way of life and their faith known. And he was saying that he mentioned this one conversation that he and his wife had. I think it was like at a park where their kids were playing, and they got to talking with this person or couple. I can't remember which it was. And as they got to talking, I mean, he's like, normally when it comes to like, oh, what do you do for your job? And he's like, well, I work at an apologetics center. It's like, I can't quite hide from the fact of like what I do is like religiously based or focused on Jesus. So it's like, out there up front. And, as the conversation progressed, the comment that this person gave in relation to their conversation was, you guys don't seem to be crunchy Christians. And the host of the podcast were saying like, well, in the United States, crunchy kind of has a different connotation. But what he meant was you're not like abrasive, like you're not like uptight. You're not like, there's not this like kind of embattled position in us having a conversation about just the little bit deeper things of life. Like you come at it from where you come from and I'm at where I'm at with it. But you're still able to have kind of just a jovial conversation with it or an easy conversation with it. And he was saying like that posture alone spoke a lot of the kind of life that they lived. And I think and he was saying like it was noticeable by the people they were talking to, and like, well, you seem to have like a hopeful posture. But in general, they were just noticing like, well, your life seems to have some things like that we long for, but you don't come about it in like an abrasive way to make it known to us. And so he was just saying like us faithfully living our life and not being like abrasive in how we did it. Again, the posture mattered a whole lot, spoke a lot of the message that they were trying to live out and the message of Jesus. And it made a pathway for them to be able to talk more about it. And so I think that's one thing for us to keep in mind of like, yes, we're called to make Jesus known, but we don't have to be like abrasive or caustic in how we do it. There are very like nuanced ways in which we can do it, but still be faithful in doing it and asserting it. It doesn't mean you have to be passive in it. But I think the posture in which we take matters a lot, is ultimately kind of, I think, what we see here. And it made me think in one way about just how we negate the witness the church has in a lot of different ways. Like one thing it made me think of is often we struggle in the church with like unity, and we know that often even Christians don't get along, and like churches split and all those different things. But even though all that stuff happens, I think there's some hope to take in the fact that even though Christians may struggle to get along sometimes, their disagreements maybe often don't end in the same way that they would in the world. They don't necessarily maybe end with the same sort of amount of mudslinging toward each other, or it made me just think of like the simple fact that Christians will gather for worship on a Sunday and may disagree with each other on certain things, but the fact that they're not going to go like beat each other up over it and still go worship together, just the fact that their disagreements aren't ending in violence is like a witness in and of itself. And so I think that does say something, that like Christians who faithfully week in and week out gather together and worship with people who they don't entirely agree with on everything, and yet can still civilly get along with each other, speaks a lot. And the main reason that we can do that's because of what we share in Christ. And I know there's maturity that needs to go beyond that, but I do think there is something to that like because Jesus is living within us, like we don't go to these other levels, or we at least hold ourselves back from going to these other levels. And I think that, again, that speaks to the fact that Jesus is working in and through our life and shaping us to try to be different kind of people in the world in which we live. And I do think that's noticeable, as much as it maybe doesn't get the notice of like the nightly news or the information outlets. Like I think it is noticed by people, and that there's a lot of other groups who would do things a lot differently. And so I think there's some value in just the faithfulness of us doing things, even though it may not look flashy or like super compelling. Like there's a like they still will do stuff together just because of Jesus. Like even though they don't agree about all these other things, because of Jesus. And it's like, well, there must be something about Jesus. I mean, as little as that may be, that's still a stepping stone. Lastly, I guess I already said lastly, but one other thing he mentioned in the podcast I thought was interesting was followers of Jesus in a post-Christian world probably need to try to think about how can we more creatively help people consider the meaningful things of life in creative ways. And he mentioned how like C.S. Lewis did this in his day by like writing the novels that he wrote, or Tolkien did with Lord of the Rings, and just like they used a genre that wasn't like biographical, but they used a genre of fiction to help tell the story of these meaningful concepts, and people are still talking about them today. Like, what are ways that we could do something similar in our day and age? And I know not everybody's a creative, but how can we maybe just more creatively ask questions about the meaningful things of life, and just not well, do you believe Jesus is the truth? And that's where we start. I mean, just the creativity of sort of backing up a few steps alone is probably something we could take into consideration. Anyway, I thought this podcast was helpful. I encourage you to take a listen to it for yourself. A little bit of warning, there's a couple words I think that get used in there that may be stronger than some people would prefer from a Christian standpoint, and I don't quite understand why people do that. It's not preferable to me, but it's in there a little bit nonetheless. I mean, it's really like, I think, two things, and it's very minor, but I do think the overall content of the podcast was very helpful in helping those of us in our day and age who are following Jesus to think about how we can make Jesus known to the world around us in a way in which we maybe hadn't had to do before. Like before, we could rely on the fact that like, well, people knew about the church, and if they wanted to show up, they show up. Well, that's maybe not the case anymore. People are becoming less and less aware, and the more generations that progresses through, they're not going to know about Jesus and the cultural norms of following Jesus that we maybe think that they are accustomed to. And so how can we insert ourselves into their life in a general conversation and general life things to where we have the opportunity to share where we're coming from with it. I mean, I think that's what we have to think about, is like, where can we gain the opportunity by listening and engaging with other people to where we then have the opportunity to share the hope that we have. So I hope these things were helpful for you and gave you some just handles for things to engage with people and some practical questions to work through with people. And I know for me, it made my brain think. And again, I struggle to do the same thing. Like, I don't do it perfectly. Like, it's a process for me as well. So I hope they're as helpful for you as they've been helpful for me to think about, and I'm trying to implement into my own life. And so next time, hopefully Mitch and I can be back together as we get past this week. And thank you for engaging and listening and watching, if you're watching, to this episode of the podcast, and we'll catch you next time.